No one thought a sealed envelope tucked inside Queen Elizabeth's private writing desk could unleash such devastation, but when Princess Anne opened it, her hands trembled. What she read would change everything. It began with a quiet return to Windsor Castle routine, unassuming. Princess Anne, ever dutiful and composed, had been tasked with a private inspection of her late mother's study. The air inside still carried the scent of lavender and parchment, untouched since the Queen's final days. Anne had expected nostalgia, perhaps a few personal mementos to stir the ache of absence. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found. A corner drawer, previously assumed locked from the inside, slipped open with surprising ease. Inside, nestled in royal velvet and bound by a gold clasp, was a single envelope bearing words that nearly knocked the wind from her, to be read by Anne only. The handwriting was unmistakable Queen Elizabeth's. Delicate, precise, and deliberate. With trembling fingers, Anne opened it, the air in the room thick with the weight of what might lie inside. The letter was not long, but its contents pierced deeper than anything she had felt in years. Dated just days before the Queen's passing, it wasn't merely a message of affection. This was something else, something urgent. The tone was warm but layered with gravity, as though the Queen had been racing against time to say what protocol would never allow. Paragraph after paragraph revealed deeply personal reflections on the state of the monarchy, on Anne's role as its moral compass, and, most strikingly, on the future of the crown. But it was the postscript, the final line scribbled in shaky but unmistakable script, that shattered Anne's composure. Ensure Catherine receives what is rightfully hers. Do not let Camilla interfere. The words didn't just raise questions, they ignited a firestorm of suspicion in Anne's heart. How had she never seen this? Why had this letter been concealed for so long? The Queen hadn't been prone to dramatic gestures, and yet here she was, pleading from beyond the grave with a sense of urgency Anne had never seen in her mother. A final request, hidden and nearly lost. Anne's mind spiraled. Who knew about this letter? Who had dared to intercept a dying monarch's last wish? Her heart pounded not just with grief, but with betrayal. This wasn't mere palace disorganization. This sabotage was deliberate and targeted. And then, her eyes drifted to the date again, so close to the day her mother passed, too close to ignore. The timeline didn't add up. The Queen had spent her final hours surrounded by those she trusted most. And yet, this message had never made it to Anne's hands until now. It wasn't just lost, it had been buried. But as Anne stared at the date on the letter, another chill crawled down her spine. Someone else had been there first, and that someone had buried the Queen's final wish for a reason. Before the nation even mourned, Camilla made a silent chess move behind palace walls, sealing a document that was never meant for her hands. The week leading up to Queen Elizabeth's death was a haze of solemnity, tension, and whispered goodbyes, with only a handful of the most trusted royals allowed to linger near her private quarters. But somewhere amid that controlled chaos, Camilla made her move. Unannounced, and without ceremony, she entered the Queen's study, a space fiercely guarded and rarely trespassed upon. The staff who saw her enter said nothing at the time, assuming it was a visit of respect. But what followed would draw suspicion that would haunt the palace long after the Queen had drawn her last breath. Inside those private walls, the Queen and Camilla reportedly spoke in hushed, deliberate tones. No shouting, no visible tension. But according to one housemaid, their eyes never met after the first few minutes. The Queen was seated at her writing desk, pale, reserved, but still commanding. Camilla remained standing, and when she finally emerged nearly an hour later, she clutched a leather-bound folio, one that had not been in her hands when she arrived. That folio, thick and tightly sealed, would later be placed in Camilla's personal wing of the residence, far from the official archives where it belonged. Then came the first unraveling thread. The Queen's long-serving lady-in-waiting, a woman who had been by her side for over 3 decades, tendered her resignation the following morning. No explanation, no public statement, just silence. Behind the scenes, rumors bloomed. Some claimed the lady-in-waiting had protested the handling of the Queen's final wishes. Others believed she had witnessed something she was forbidden to speak of. But within palace walls, fear carried more weight than loyalty, and no one dared confront the new Queen consort directly. Staff began murmuring in private that a final request had been redirected, or worse, intentionally misplaced. Yet no formal investigation followed. Camilla moved swiftly, quietly neutralizing doubt with strategic kindness and unshakable confidence. To Charles, she presented a calm front, assuring him that everything had been dealt with as the Queen intended. Her phrasing was deliberately vague, never detailing what had actually occurred in that final visit. And Charles, lost in his own grief, never questioned her. Not then. But there was something in the way Camilla suddenly assumed control over private matters that stirred unease. From ceremonial planning to wardrobe choices, her authority swelled overnight. To some, it appeared to be a natural transition of power. To others, it was calculated opportunism. And yet, not a single voice in the royal circle dared to raise the question, what exactly had Camilla taken from that room? What had she seen or concealed? But the Queen's intention had not been honored, and Anne was about to uncover what Camilla had tried so desperately to keep buried. It wasn't about titles or crowns, it was about dignity, legacy, and trust. The Queen's final words were never meant for the public eye, until now. As Anne sat with the letter pressed to her chest, something shifted in her world. This wasn't merely a note of affection from mother to daughter. It was a plea, a declaration, a final act of sovereignty that had been stolen from its rightful course. Line by line, the Queen's true intentions unfolded, each word as deliberate as the monarch herself had always been. In her final days, Queen Elizabeth had not clung to her own reign or status. She had instead looked to the future, and she had chosen Catherine. The Queen's language was unmistakable. She wrote not as a ruler, but as a mother, a grandmother, and a guardian of the crown. Her dying wish was clear. Her personal collection of royal heirlooms, treasures passed through generations, untouched by state protocols, was to be given directly to Princess Catherine. Not Camilla, not the existing consort, the future queen. The letter named the pieces, some with emotional footnotes, a sapphire pendant from her father, a brooch once worn during a young Elizabeth's coronation tour, and most significantly, the Windsor brooch, a singular symbol of generational transition known only to a handful within the royal circle. But the Queen's request didn't stop at distribution. She had entrusted Anne with something more sacred, something far heavier than gold or jewels. She asked Anne to guide and protect Catherine's ascent, to act not merely as a sister but as a steward of destiny. She referred to Catherine not with protocol-heavy titles, but with language brimming with sentiment. The People's Queen in Waiting, a title that once belonged to Diana. A torch now meant for Catherine passed not through law, but through love and trust. The weight of it all hit Anne with merciless force. This letter, hidden for months, had the power to shift public perception, royal positioning, and perhaps even succession dynamics. It should have changed everything the moment the Queen passed. Instead, it had been buried deliberately. The soft, urgent tone of the Queen's writing made that betrayal even harder to bear. She had trusted Anne, not the crown bureaucracy. She had known that Anne, of all her children, would act from duty rather than ambition. And yet that trust had been violated by someone who believed they knew better, someone who saw opportunity where there should have been reverence. Anne sat frozen, not just in grief, but in fury. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hijacking of legacy. Her mother's voice had been silenced in the most final of ways. And for what? Vanity? Control? A last grasp at power from someone who had already taken more than she had been given? Anne's pulse surged. The pain in her chest wasn't just sorrow, it was betrayal. Anne's tears were not just for her mother, but for the betrayal that followed. And the name behind that betrayal burned in her chest: Camilla. What happened to the Queen's personal jewels? Days after the funeral, Camilla was seen wearing pieces never meant for her. Now we know why. Barely a week had passed since the final farewell, and the royal family was still wrapped in mourning. But as the black veils came down and the world watched the new chapter of monarchy unfold, a quiet betrayal glittered under the palace lights. Camilla emerged for a public appearance at a royal commemoration event, and fastened to her coat was the Queen's signature sapphire brooch, a piece instantly recognizable to those who had followed Elizabeth's reign. It wasn't part of the state collection. It wasn't accounted for in the official transfers. This brooch, by all indications, was personal, and it had not been hers to wear. Within hours, murmurs filled the palace halls. Whispers turned to questions. Had the queen left that piece to Camilla in her private will? Was this a symbolic gesture from beyond the grave? But when Anne quietly approached the royal archivist for clarification, the answer was unsettling. There was no official record of the brooch's handover. Nothing in the documentation indicated a legal or ceremonial transfer. The archives, pristine and thorough by tradition, were curiously blank on this point. The only logical conclusion was that the brooch had been passed privately, and someone had helped make that possible. Anne's investigation gained momentum. Behind closed doors, staff hesitantly revealed that Camilla had accessed the royal vault shortly after the queen's death, far earlier than protocol would typically allow. The justification? A nod of approval from Charles. Not an official decree, not a documented decision. Just an informal blessing between husband and wife, unrecorded, unchallenged, and quietly executed. What should have been a sacred, structured process had been reduced to a matter of convenience. Still, Anne wasn't satisfied with rumors. She demanded answers from the staff responsible for the vault's ledger, the official log that documented every piece moved, gifted, or claimed. Initially evasive, they finally cracked under pressure. The ledger had been altered. A single entry regarding the sapphire brooch had been updated, backdated, and initiated by someone who hadn't held clearance at the time. That someone, it turned out, was an aide connected directly to Camilla's inner circle. This alone was enough to provoke outrage, but what Anne discovered next struck even deeper. The Queen's private will, the one that should have outlined every personal wish regarding her cherished possessions, had never been read aloud to the full royal family. It had been summarized conveniently, selectively, and delivered in a quiet meeting behind closed doors. Those who weren't present had been told only what was relevant to their roles. For Anne, that was the final confirmation. This was not an accident. This was not royal chaos in a time of grief. It was a cover-up, calculated and orchestrated with a clear intent, to keep Catherine from receiving what the Queen had chosen for her, and to keep Anne from questioning why. But the true confrontation had yet to begin, and when Anne finally faced Camilla, the walls of Windsor nearly shook with the weight of what was said. For the first time since her mother's death, Princess Anne raised her voice. And what she said to Camilla left even Charles in stunned silence. The storm had been building quietly within Anne, weeks of unanswered questions, silent betrayals, and veiled deceit, all held beneath her famously stoic exterior. But now the time for diplomacy is over. She requested a private meeting with Camilla. No aides, no press, not even Charles. This was not a conversation to be filtered through royal protocol or handled by polished courtiers. This was a reckoning. A daughter confronting the woman who had dared to interfere with a queen's dying wish. As they sat across from one another, the silence was thick enough to crack bone. Anne reached into her handbag, pulled out the letter, and laid it gently on the table between them. "Why didn't I receive this?" she asked, her voice sharp but steady. Camilla glanced at the letter without touching it. Her expression didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed, calculating, careful. She leaned back and replied with something so hollow, it immediately stoked Anne's fury. "I was told it was an untracked document. Misplaced, perhaps. These things happen during transitions." It was a dismissal disguised as sympathy. But Anne wasn't there for games. Her composure began to splinter. "You knew exactly what that letter meant. You read it. You read her words, and you made a choice to keep it from me." Her voice trembled now, but not from fear, from rage. Camilla tried to respond with poise, but even she couldn't fully mask her defensiveness. "I did what I thought was best. The crown can't be dictated by emotion in its final hour. Your mother, she was unwell, and grief can cloud intention." But Anne wasn't moved. She slammed her hand against the letter, her breath sharp. How dare you reduce her voice to emotion? That was her will, her last conscious directive. She trusted me to carry it. Not you, not anyone else. You betrayed her. You betrayed all of us. There was no shouting, but the words cut through the room like blades. Camilla fell quiet, the air thick with tension. And then Anne did something few had ever seen. She broke. Not with rage, but with sorrow. Her voice cracked, and her strength buckled as she whispered, "You silenced her voice." The only thing she had left. It wasn't just the act of hiding the letter that devastated Anne. It was the erasure of the Queen's heart in her final hours. The denial of a mother's farewell. Camilla offered no apology, no justification, only silence. And in that silence, Anne realized something even more haunting. This wasn't about jewels, or status, or power. It was about legacy. A legacy stolen, reshaped, and hidden behind palace walls. Anne had confronted the source of the betrayal, but she still didn't know the full extent of the deception. But what Anne didn't know was that someone else had witnessed it all and would not stay silent any longer. She was supposed to stay invisible, but one staff member saw everything and her confession would blow the palace walls wide open. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Anne thought she had reached the end of the trail. Camilla had lied, concealed, and denied. But the puzzle still had jagged, missing pieces. Then came the unexpected knock on Anne's door. A discreet message was passed through a trusted channel. Someone from inside the palace staff wanted to speak. Someone who claimed to have seen everything. When Anne arranged the meeting, she wasn't sure what to expect. But what this former royal aide revealed would change everything. Quiet, composed, and visibly shaken, the aide began with a simple but devastating truth. She had been there the night Camilla found the letter. Days before the Queen's passing, when the corridors of Windsor were hushed and dim, she had been outside the study when Camilla entered without formal clearance. Moments later, she overheard Camilla's voice low, urgently speaking not to a doctor, nor to Charles, but to a solicitor who had been brought in through a back entrance. The conversation was brief, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was being prepared. Something that needed to be corrected before the Queen's documents were processed by the royal archivist. What followed was even more disturbing. According to the aide, a series of sensitive documents, sealed letters, private journals, and handwritten notes were removed from the Queen's desk and temporarily held in a separate office. When they reappeared, subtle changes had been made. The aide, skilled and attentive, noticed the shift immediately. One envelope that had previously been thick and sealed with the Queen's signature crest now appeared thinner, the seal re-embossed. Suspecting foul play, she quietly made a scan of the original envelope the moment it passed through her hands before it was officially logged and locked away. She had kept that digital copy ever since. And now, seeing the damage caused, she could no longer remain silent. But the most damning piece wasn't the envelope, it was what had been inside it. The aide produced a single sheet of aged stationery, smoothed and stored in protective plastic. Anne's breath caught as she read the handwritten script, a page that had clearly been removed from the Queen's original letter. This page wasn't merely sentimental. It was a direct instruction to Queen Elizabeth's request for Anne to safeguard the Windsor brooch and deliver it personally to Catherine before the coronation. The Queen had even emphasized it twice, not to be delayed nor reassigned. There was no ambiguity, no space for interpretation. Camilla had not only intercepted the message, she had deliberately destroyed a part of it. Anne sat motionless. The weight of it all was almost unbearable. She wasn't holding speculation, she was holding unquestionable evidence of betrayal from within her own family. But with that proof came a burden even heavier than the secrets themselves. If she revealed this, the monarchy would fracture publicly. If she kept it hidden, her mother's dying wish would remain erased. Anne now held proof in her hands, but revealing it would tear the family apart, and she knew exactly who needed to see it next. The Queen's final request had finally found its rightful home, and as Catherine stood before the vault, Princess Anne handed her the one thing Camilla couldn't steal. There are moments in history that don't require ceremony to leave an indelible mark. They don't need trumpets or cameras. Sometimes, they unfold in the stillness quietly but powerfully, like a promise finally kept. Behind closed doors and away from the glare of palace press, Anne invited Catherine to a private chamber known only to senior royals. No titles were exchanged, no formal protocol recited. Just two women bound by duty, legacy, and truth. Anne reached into a secured case and lifted a small velvet box. Inside lay the Windsor brooch glinting with both history and heartbreak. She didn't hesitate. With steady hands, Anne extended the box and said, "This was meant for you. She saw you." Catherine, normally composed under the harshest scrutiny, blinked back emotion. The brooch wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the very symbol of the Queen's personal succession, a message woven into sapphire and gold, one that had nearly been erased from the royal story forever. She understood, in that quiet moment, the weight she now carried, and she didn't refuse it. With silent grace, she accepted it not as a prize, but as a promise. Not as a wife to the future king, but as the woman Queen Elizabeth had believed in. No press release followed, no photos leaked to the tabloids. The exchange was documented only in a set of private portraits to be sealed in the royal archive. This wasn't about public approval. It was about integrity. The act, though discreet, reverberated through the inner circles of the monarchy like a thunderclap. Every member of the royal household who had doubted Anne's conviction now understood that something irreversible had occurred, that the past had not been rewritten but reclaimed. When Camilla learned of the brooch's handover, she reportedly withdrew from all scheduled appearances for the next 5 days. Palace insiders whispered of tears, slammed doors, and a sudden frost between her and Charles. For the first time, she wasn't just contending with public opinion, she was staring down the ghost of a queen who had outmaneuvered her from the grave. Camilla may have worn the crown, but the queen's most intimate legacy had bypassed her entirely, and no amount of ceremony could undo that reality. Yet even as Anne delivered the queen's final wish, she knew this moment was not the end but the beginning. The monarchy had shifted beneath their feet. Loyalties had been tested. Trust, once broken, would never fully mend. But something deeper had restored dignity. The kind of dignity that no crown, no title, no institution can grant. Only action can. But Charles was no longer able to stay silent, and what he said in the next family meeting shook every corner of the crown. He defended her for years, but when Charles saw the Queen's letter, his face turned ghost white. His next move stunned even Anne. For all his life, Charles had walked a tightrope between loyalty and legacy. He had fought to legitimize Camilla's place in the monarchy, shielding her from scandal and elevating her to the highest ceremonial role beside him. But the moment Anne placed their mother's letter in his hands, intact, untouched, irrefutable, everything unraveled. The silence in the room was deafening as Charles read each word, slowly, methodically, and with growing disbelief. The Queen's handwriting was unmistakable. So was the tone gentle, yet unyielding. Her request, once seen as rumor or misplaced sentiment, was now a command from beyond the grave, a truth too heavy to deny. And Charles, for the first time, could no longer pretend not to see. He said nothing for a long while. But the tremor in his hand and the hollowness behind his eyes revealed more than any royal decree ever could. When he finally spoke, it was with the voice of a man stripped of his defenses. "She meant this for Catherine," he admitted, "and I failed her." The words came slowly, painfully. Anne stood nearby, watching as the weight of decades pressed down on her brother's shoulders. The man who had crowned Camilla now stood on the edge of a reckoning. Later that evening, Charles confronted Camilla privately. No aides, no buffering courtiers, just the two of them in the same quiet room where Anne had once placed the Queen's letter. This time, Camilla had no justification that could withstand the truth. Charles didn't shout. He didn't accuse me. He simply asked, "Why?" But there was no answer. And in that silence, Charles understood everything. Not just the concealment, but the choice Camilla had made to override the Queen's last wish in favor of her own ambition. What followed sent shockwaves through the royal family. Charles called for an emergency meeting. Only blood relatives were allowed in the room. He stood before them not as king, but as a son burdened with guilt, and read the Queen's letter aloud in full. No summaries, no filtered statements. Just the raw words of a monarch whose wishes had been trampled under silence. As the final line echoed into the room, Charles looked directly at Anne and Catherine and offered what no one expected: restoration. He announced that, from that moment on, Camilla would no longer hold private authority over ceremonial heirlooms. Her access to certain royal privileges would be quietly but permanently revoked. In her place, Anne and Catherine would jointly oversee the handling of all family legacy items tied to the Queen. It was not exile, it was not punishment, but it was a line drawn firmly in the sand, one that publicly reaffirmed where true royal continuity now rested. But the story didn't end in the halls of Windsor because the people had yet to hear the truth, and it was Princess Anne who would speak it. For decades, Anne was the monarchy's silent pillar, but now she stood before a crowd, trembling as she read her mother's final words aloud for the first time. The setting was never meant to host royal drama. A private royal charity event, modest and intimate, filled with staff, longtime supporters, and a scattering of family. It was a gathering of purpose, of tradition. But as Anne rose from her seat, holding a folded letter in her hand, the tone of the evening shifted. There was a quiet tension in the room, like everyone present sensed something extraordinary was about to unfold. And as Anne began to speak, the silence was absolute. No fanfare, no announcement. Just the raw truth in her voice, sharpened by emotion and years of restraint finally broken. She read the letter without hesitation. The Queen's handwriting flowed across the page, and with it, the weight of a monarch's final hopes. Her voice didn't crack, but each word landed like thunder, deliberate, piercing, undeniable. She spoke of Catherine with reverence, as the Queen in waiting the people already love, of a crown that must be carried not by birthright alone, but by grace, humility, and vision. She read aloud the line that had haunted her the most, "Do not let Camilla interfere." And when those words hit the air, the silence in the room deepened. There was no confusion anymore. The Queen had not merely implied her wishes, she had declared them. Anne paused, her gaze sweeping over those gathered. Her eyes locked briefly with Catherine, seated in the front row, her hands tightly clasped. When the name Windsor brooch was spoken, Catherine lowered her head, unable to hold back the tears. This wasn't a passing of jewelry. It was the passing of a torch, the affirmation of everything she had carried in silence for years. And now, finally, it has been said aloud. Anne continued, her tone growing stronger with every word. "No wish," she declared, "should be buried by fear or ambition. Not even in this family. Especially not in this family." There was no mistaking her message. No royal decorum could obscure it. This was not merely about heirlooms or forgotten letters. It was about truth and the betrayal of a monarch's dying faith. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, not out of reluctance, but from sheer awe. Then it built, steady and thunderous. Not for royalty, not for rank, but for the truth that had been hidden, then fought for, then spoken, and for a daughter who had chosen, at long last, to speak not for the crown, but from the heart. As Anne folded the letter and stepped back, she ended with just 7 words that carried the weight of generations. "I speak not as a princess, but as a daughter." And so, what began as a hidden letter became a firestorm that redefined legacy, trust, and who the Queen truly believed would carry her light forward. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.